Have you ever felt watched in the forest? What if time moved differently there? These 10 true stories from Pacific Northwest Forest will shake you. 10 people experience the impossible. Vanishing hours, trails that loop endlessly, screams that repeat on a schedule. We are talking time distortion, impossible geography, and encounters nobody can explain. All names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy, but the experiences documented here are 100% authentic and verified. Comment your location and what time you're watching. Subscribe to Unspoken Fears for more unexplained mysteries that defy explanation. My name is Nathaniel, and I'm a 34-year-old wilderness photographer from Seattle. I need to tell you what happened to me on September 15th at Mount Rainier National Park, because I've been holding this inside for too long. And frankly, I don't care if people think I'm crazy anymore. What I'm about to share defies every logical explanation I've tried to construct. And I've had months to think about this, to question my own sanity, to wonder if I'm experiencing some kind of delayed trauma response. But the evidence doesn't lie, and my body remembers things my mind can't explain. I had driven up to the Paradise Trail specifically to capture golden hour light crossing the Tatoosh Range. The forecast was unusually clear for the Pacific Northwest in September, which meant I might actually get usable footage without the typical fog and cloud cover that plagues this region. I arrived at the trailhead around 1:30 p.m., giving myself what I calculated to be plenty of time to hike the 1.5 miles to my desired shooting location. I wanted to reach a rocky outcrop I'd scouted on a previous visit, a place that provided unobstructed views of the peaks and allowed me to set up my professional camera equipment with stability and security. By 2:47 p.m., I had everything positioned exactly as I wanted it. My tripod was locked into place on solid ground. I'd checked the battery levels twice, inserted a brand new SD card with full capacity, and programmed the interval settings for 4-second captures every 10 seconds. This would give me excellent resolution for the time-lapse sequence while conserving storage space. I spent the next several minutes checking my watch obsessively, something I always do when shooting during specific weather windows. I wanted to time the sequence to begin exactly at the moment the sun's angle shifted just right, creating that perfect golden light that photographers live for. The afternoon was cool but pleasant, and the moss-covered Douglas firs surrounding the outcrop created this almost cathedral-like atmosphere, so quiet and meditative that I felt completely alone in the world. But I should have noticed something unusual right then. The moss coating those ancient trees had crystalline frost patterns across its surface, intricate designs that shouldn't have existed in September heat. I was so focused on camera settings, so absorbed in technical preparation, that I didn't register this as abnormal. I probably would have dismissed it anyway, attributing it to morning dew that hadn't yet burned off, even though it was mid-afternoon and the sun had been strong for hours. Around 3:15 p.m., something changed. I started hearing sounds that I can only describe as reversed audio coming from the forest immediately surrounding my position. This is the part where I know how unbelievable this sounds, but I'm going to describe it anyway because accuracy matters. The bird calls were backwards. The wind in the pine needles sounded like it was being played in reverse on a stereo system. Even the subtle rustling and movement of small animals in the underbrush was inverted somehow. It was like someone had taken the authentic forest soundscape and deliberately flipped it backwards. I turned away from my camera to investigate, fully expecting to see another hiker with unusual equipment, perhaps someone conducting their own audio recording experiment. But the forest appeared completely normal. Absolutely nothing was visually unusual. The sun filtered through the canopy in familiar patterns. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I shook off the unease, attributing the strange sounds to exhaustion, or perhaps my ears playing tricks on me. I returned my focus to the camera and the approaching sunset. Everything felt normal after that moment, or so I thought. I spent the next hour or so adjusting my position slightly, taking a few handheld shots from different angles to supplement the time-lapse footage. I checked that the tripod-mounted camera was still capturing perfectly, and I remember checking the footage preview every few minutes. Time seemed to move at its normal pace. I ate a protein bar around 4:30 p.m. I remember that specifically because I thought about how I had 3 hours until sunset. 3 hours of perfect light to work with. I was content, focused, completely engaged in my work. Then something fundamental changed in my awareness. I was looking at my camera screen, reviewing some of the captured frames to ensure proper exposure, when I noticed the playback counter showing an unusual number. The timestamp on the first frame read 2:47 p.m., exactly when I started the sequence, but the camera was already showing 7:43 p.m. on the internal timestamp. I thought I was misreading it, that my eyes were deceiving me, but the numbers didn't change. That's 7 hours and 43 minutes, I thought. That's impossible. I pulled out my phone immediately to double-check the time. The screen read 10:31 p.m. I felt my stomach drop. My hands started shaking. I looked at my wrist, at my analog watch, which I always wear because it doesn't rely on batteries or network signals. And it also read 10:31 p.m. Every timepiece I possessed was telling me the same impossible story. I had lost 7 hours and 44 minutes from my conscious awareness. I never blacked out, never felt any time passing abnormally, never experienced any sensation of unconsciousness or fugue state. My first instinct was pure adrenaline-fueled panic. I couldn't rationalize how this had happened. I grabbed my equipment and started to leave the outcrop, but something made me stop. I needed to see the footage. I needed to understand what my camera had recorded during those missing hours. I powered on my camera and transferred the SD card to my laptop right there, hands trembling, using the remaining battery power to review the footage frame by frame. What I found was so horrifying that I had to stop multiple times and step away to breathe. The entire video sequence showed the exact same scene from the exact angle, unchanging in its composition, except for one detail that made my skin crawl. In every single frame, including the very first and the very last, there was a figure in the background, a silhouette of a human form, and that silhouette was me, standing completely motionless for the entire recorded duration, 7 hours and 43 minutes of unbroken footage. And I never moved once in any frame. My arms remained at my sides. My posture was identical in every shot. Even my head angle never changed. This was impossible because I had clearly moved around during those hours. I had walked to different locations. I had adjusted the camera. I had eaten my protein bar. I had done things, and yet the footage showed only stillness. Here's the truly disturbing part. I wasn't even wearing the clothes I was wearing when I checked the footage that night. In the video, I was wearing my old blue hiking jacket, but I was wearing my newer red one when I started. The colors were completely different. The fit was different. Everything was different. I have no memory of changing clothes, no memory of removing one jacket and putting on another. But the most unsettling discovery came when I examined the final 14 minutes of the recorded sequence. Something began moving in that section. A shadow that couldn't correspond to any tree or rock formation in the immediate landscape. The shadow was roughly humanoid in shape, I suppose you could say, but wrong in a way I struggled to find words for. It moved with an unnatural gait, gliding rather than walking, and it was gradually getting closer to my frozen silhouette. Frame after frame, it was closer to where I stood, paralyzed and completely unaware. The shadow's final position in the very last frame was approximately 3 feet directly behind where my motionless body stood when the footage ended. When that final frame disappeared from the screen, that's when something shifted in my physical body. It was like a reset switch had been activated. My muscles suddenly activated all at once, cramping and spasming intensely. I realized with horror that my entire body felt like it hadn't been used in days, stretched and stiff and aching. I checked myself in my reflection and discovered I was covered in that strange frost I'd noticed on the trees earlier, crystalline patterns all over my hair, my jacket, my exposed skin. Most disturbingly, my boots were caked with dark soil from the far side of the outcrop, a section of trail that I would have to consciously walk to reach. I have zero memory of walking there, none whatsoever. I hiked back down to the trailhead in near darkness, my entire mind spinning with confusion and fear. I drove directly to the ranger station and reported everything. The rangers checked the trails, found nothing unusual, and frankly seemed skeptical of my entire account. They suggested theories ranging from equipment malfunction to partial fugue state to dehydration-induced hallucinations. I had the footage right there, the video evidence on my camera, but showing it to authorities somehow made it feel less real, like I was sharing evidence of something my own mind had fabricated. I had the camera and all my equipment checked by professional technicians. Every component functioned perfectly. The lenses were undamaged, the sensors were fine. The footage was completely authentic, not corrupted, not artificially manipulated. But I still don't know what that shadow was, and I don't know if it reached me or if maybe, just maybe, it succeeded in something far worse than simply reaching me. My name is Grace, and I've been a park ranger with the National Park Service for just over 12 years. Most of that time I've spent patrolling the Hoh Rainforest in Olympic National Park, which means I know these trails like I know the lines on my own hands. I've walked them in every season, every weather condition, every time of day. I know where the mud gets deep after rain. I know which sections of trail are prone to washouts. I know the sound the ancient Sitka spruces make when the wind picks up. I know this forest. Or at least I thought I did until November 3rd, when the forest taught me that knowledge means nothing. When the rules governing physical space decide to change, I started my shift that morning around 8 a.m. The weather forecast had warned of dense fog rolling in around midday, but conditions were clear. When I left the ranger station, I had planned a routine patrol of the northern patrol route, the same circuit I've completed hundreds of times. This particular route covers approximately 8 miles and includes 12 GPS waypoint markers placed at regular quarter-mile intervals along the trail. The waypoints serve multiple purposes: safety checkpoints for rangers, reference points for accurate distance tracking, and emergency response coordinates if anyone gets lost or injured. I've stood at every one of those markers countless times. By 11:30 a.m., the fog had rolled in exactly as predicted. Dense, impenetrable fog that reduced visibility to maybe 15 feet on a good stretch. It was the kind of fog where you can barely see the trees directly in front of you, where sound becomes muffled and disorienting. I considered turning back and cutting my patrol short, but I'd already covered the first mile and a half without incident, and I knew the trail well enough to navigate safely even in zero visibility. That's what I told myself anyway. I was confident, perhaps overconfident, in my familiarity with this particular route. I reached waypoint marker DER-7 at approximately 12:15 p.m. I always check the marker itself, verify my GPS coordinates match, and document the timestamp in my patrol log. This waypoint is located near an interesting geological feature, a small ravine with moss-covered boulders and a trickling stream. I sat on one of the boulders for a few minutes, eating a sandwich and drinking water from my pack. The fog was thick around me, the ancient Sitka spruces creating towering shadows that faded into grayness overhead. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be. I consulted my GPS unit and noted that marker DER-8 should be approximately 0.25 miles ahead, a quarter-mile distance that shouldn't take more than 5 or 6 minutes to traverse at normal walking speed. I stood up, shouldered my pack, and proceeded forward along the trail. I was careful with my footing, mindful of the fog, but I was also confident. I knew this section of trail as well as any ranger could. I could probably walk it blindfolded, or so I thought. I walked for what I estimated to be about 5 minutes, checking my GPS unit periodically to ensure I was maintaining the correct bearing. The GPS confirmed I was moving forward at a reasonable pace, closing the distance between markers. Then something impossible happened. I reached a familiar junction, a place where I could distinguish the trail marker from the surrounding fog. I looked at it, and my heart went cold. Waypoint marker W7, exactly where I had started my quarter-mile journey. I thought the GPS had malfunctioned. I thought perhaps I had walked in a circle without realizing it. I checked the GPS unit again. The coordinates matched marker N7, absolutely identical. I checked my watch. I had only been walking for approximately 5 minutes, exactly the amount of time needed to cover a quarter mile. But I was back at the starting point. I decided to try again. I turned around, walked in what I was absolutely certain was a different direction, perhaps trying to avoid whatever loop I'd accidentally created. I walked for 7 minutes this time, walking longer and farther to ensure I was escaping whatever had just happened. The GPS showed me moving in a straight line away from marker 7, the distance counter increasing steadily. I should have reached marker 8 and then some. Instead, I found myself standing at waypoint marker 7 again, the exact same marker, the exact same ravine, the exact same boulders. I was standing where I had started. My hands started shaking. A cold sweat broke out across my back. I tried to calm myself down. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the GPS was malfunctioning. Perhaps I was more disoriented than I realized. Perhaps the fog was affecting my judgment and perception. I attempted several more times to move away from that marker. I tried walking in different directions. I attempted to navigate using landmarks rather than GPS. Every single time, within minutes, I found myself back at waypoint marker W7. I tried ignoring the trail entirely and cutting through the forest, thinking I could bypass whatever impossible loop had trapped me. But even leaving the established trail, even walking directly through undisturbed undergrowth, every path led me back to the same marker within 5 or 6 minutes. I was trapped in a circle, a loop that seemed to have a radius of approximately a quarter mile. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were boot prints in the mud near the waypoint marker. Fresh prints, not yet drowned out by fog moisture. And as I examined them more closely, I realized with building horror that they were my prints. My particular boot tread pattern is distinctive. I've identified my own footprints at crime scenes before. These prints formed a perfect spiral pattern around the marker, rotating outward in concentric circles. The spiral had no beginning and no end. It just continued around, and the footprints were absolutely fresh. I looked down at my boots, and they were covered in fresh mud, caked with soil from the forest floor. I had made those spiral prints. I had walked that spiral pattern while somehow believing I was walking in a straight line away from the marker. My mind reeled. I sat down on one of the moss-covered boulders and tried to breathe slowly, tried to think clearly. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The world had contracted to just me, the boulders, and the waypoint marker. I decided to stop fighting the loop. I decided to just sit there and wait. Maybe the fog would clear. Maybe my mind would clarify. Maybe the impossible phenomenon would reverse itself if I simply stopped trying to escape it. I had water. I had food. I had my radio. I could call for assistance if necessary. I settled onto the boulder and waited. 3 hours passed like this. 3 hours of sitting in the fog, listening to the forest, feeling increasingly disconnected from my own body. Around 3:45 p.m. something changed. The fog began to lift, not gradually but suddenly, as if someone had simply turned off a switch. Within minutes, my visibility expanded from 15 feet to 50 feet to 100 feet. I could suddenly see the forest in its full 3-dimensional glory, the ancient trees rising up around me, the moss-covered forest floor stretching out in all directions. And then I realized I wasn't at waypoint marker 7 anymore. I was standing at waypoint marker 12. Marker 12 is located approximately 1.25 miles ahead on the patrol route, a full 5 markers past where I had been trapped. I had no memory of walking those 1.25 miles. No memory of the journey. No memory of covering that distance. I checked my GPS unit with trembling hands. The coordinates confirmed marker 12. I checked my patrol log. The timestamp of my last entry was marked at marker 7, recorded at 12:15 p.m. 4 hours had passed. I looked at my watch. 3:47 p.m. 4 hours and 32 minutes had vanished from my conscious awareness, but my GPS log told a strange story. According to the device, I had never left marker 7's coordinates. The entire GPS track showed me stationary at that single location for the entire duration. Even though I had walked, repeatedly, multiple times, the GPS insisted I had never moved. I had walked distances that the GPS refused to acknowledge. I stood at marker 12, and I looked back down the trail toward where marker 7 should be, obscured by distance and forest. I thought about the spiral footprints, the ones I had made while believing I was walking straight. I thought about the 4 hours that had simply vanished. I thought about the impossible loop that defied every principle of geography and space that I understood. But most of all, I thought about the Sitka spruces around marker 7. Those ancient trees with their spiraling moss patterns, moss that grew in perfect spirals up their trunks, all rotating the same direction. I've walked past those trees hundreds of times in my 12 years as a ranger, and I've never noticed that moss pattern before. I don't patrol that particular route anymore. The park reassigned me to a different section of the forest, a different series of trails and waypoints. When other rangers asked me why I requested the transfer, I couldn't find the words to explain. I couldn't tell them what happened, because the evidence doesn't support my account. The GPS data shows nothing unusual. The patrol log shows nothing remarkable. Only my testimony remains. Only my memory. And memories can be wrong, can't they? Every night, I wonder if I made those spiral footprints while walking in a hypnotic state. I wonder if the 4 hours were somehow lost to a fugue state I don't remember. I wonder if my mind simply fabricated the impossible loop as a way of processing stress or trauma. But then I remember the moss spirals on those ancient trees, and I remember that I've stood at those trees hundreds of times without ever noticing those patterns before. And I realize that either I'm losing my mind, or the forest itself is capable of doing something that violates every law of physics I understand. My name is Diego. I'm a 29-year-old software engineer from Seattle, and I consider myself someone who makes rational decisions based on data and evidence. That's probably why what happened to me on the Lewis River Trail feels so impossible to articulate, because I can't process it through the lens of logic and reason. I can't reduce it to a problem with a definable solution. I can only tell you what I experienced, what I documented, and what the physical evidence showed me, even when that evidence contradicted itself so completely that I questioned my own sanity. I had planned a solo camping trip for the weekend in October, a last chance to get outside before winter weather made the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest less welcoming. I've hiked the Lewis River Trail multiple times. It's one of my favorite places in Washington State. The old-growth forest creates this sense of stepping into a different world entirely. The trail runs alongside the Lewis River, winding through Douglas fir and western red cedar, with multiple waterfalls visible along the route. I decided to do an off-trail dispersed camping trip, something less structured than camping at an established campground. I wanted solitude and the challenge of finding my own camping spot. I parked at the Lower Falls trailhead around 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoon. The weather was decent, cool but clear, and I had packed everything I needed for 2 nights in the backcountry. I hiked for about 4 hours, covering approximately 8 miles, and then I began looking for a suitable camping location. I wanted somewhere off the main trail, away from other hikers, but still reasonably accessible. I found a spot about 200 yards off the main trail, nestled in a grove of younger Douglas firs, with a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, established a basic camp, and spent the evening reading and enjoying the quiet. The next morning, Sunday, I woke up early and decided to do a day hike, exploring some of the upper sections of the trail that I hadn't visited before. I left my camp intact, just taking water and some snacks. I planned to return by late afternoon. I was gone for about 7 hours, hiking to the Upper Falls area and beyond, covering roughly 6 miles. When I returned to my campsite around 5 p.m., I was tired but satisfied with the day's exploration. I was looking forward to a quiet evening and the hike back to the trailhead the next morning. But as I approached my camp, something felt wrong. The light was hitting the forest at an odd angle. The shadows were deeper than they should have been. I noticed the dense undergrowth looked disturbed, like something had pushed through it recently. My heart started racing as I got closer. My tent was still there. My gear was still there. But something else was wrong. About 50 yards away from my camp, deeper in the forest, I could see what looked like another tent, but it was partially collapsed, torn, covered in debris. I immediately went to investigate. My gut told me something bad had happened. As I got closer, I could see it was definitely a campsite, but not an active one. There was a tent, severely damaged, fabric torn, pole broken. It looked like it had been abandoned for weeks. There were clothes scattered in a rough circle around the tent, a sleeping bag that had been turned inside out, a backpack with its straps severed as if cut with a knife. There were also drag marks in the dark soil, trails of disturbed earth leading away from the campsite and disappearing into the dense underbrush. The drag marks were deep, suggesting something heavy had been pulled through the soil with significant force. They looked like body drag marks, or the marks of someone being pulled across the ground against their will. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I immediately pulled out my phone and took dozens of photographs. I documented everything: the tent, the scattered clothes, the backpack, the drag marks, everything. I wanted to have visual evidence of what I was seeing. My hands were shaking as I held the phone. I knew I had to report this. I had to tell someone. I walked back to the main trail and hiked about a mile until I found a junction with decent cell signal. I used my emergency radio to contact the ranger station. I reported finding what appeared to be an abandoned campsite with potential signs of a missing person. The ranger station said they would send a search team. It would take them approximately 90 minutes to reach my location. Because they had to hike in, I gave them precise GPS coordinates and descriptions of the campsite. I hiked back to the main trail near my camp and waited. I was sitting on a log about 30 minutes later when the search team arrived. 3 rangers with full gear. They were professional and calm. They took my report. They had me point them to the location of the campsite I'd found. I led them directly to it, through the forest, following the same path I had taken earlier. When we reached the location, I felt my entire body go cold. The campsite was gone. The tent was gone. The scattered clothes were gone. The backpack was gone. The drag marks had vanished. The forest floor was completely undisturbed. Pristine, ancient moss covered the area like it had been undisturbed for decades. The underbrush was thick and untouched. There was no evidence that anyone had ever been there. The rangers looked at me with expressions ranging from skeptical to concerned. One of them asked if I was sure I had the right location. I checked my GPS. The coordinates matched exactly what I had recorded. This was definitely the right place. I insisted that the campsite had been there minutes ago. I showed them the photographs on my phone. The images were clear, unmistakable: a tent, scattered clothes, a destroyed backpack, drag marks leading into the forest. The rangers examined the photos, exchanged glances with each other, and one of them suggested that perhaps the photographs were taken somewhere else. Perhaps I had confused locations. I was adamant. I knew exactly where I was. I knew exactly what I had seen. Then one of the rangers pointed down at my boots. I looked down, and my heart began racing again. My boots were covered in dark soil, the same dark soil from the area where the campsite had been. The soil was under my fingernails, embedded in the fabric of my pants, all over my hands. The rangers took samples of this soil, documenting it with cameras and collection bags. They expanded their search, looking for any evidence of a campsite in the surrounding area. They found nothing. After an hour of searching, they concluded that either I had misidentified the location or the photographs were taken elsewhere. They offered to continue investigating, but suggested that perhaps I should return to the trailhead. I hiked back with one of the rangers, feeling numb and confused. I couldn't explain what had happened. I had physical evidence of the campsite on my phone. I had soil samples under my nails and on my clothes, but the actual campsite didn't exist. When I reached my vehicle, I immediately drove to the ranger station and provided copies of all my photographs. I made an official report of a potential missing person. I gave them all the details I could remember: the style of tent, the color of the backpack, the condition of the clothing. I told them about the drag marks. I told them everything. 10 days later, I received a phone call from the ranger station. A missing person report had been filed. A female hiker named Rebecca had been reported missing by her family. She was last seen hiking in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest area around the same time I was there. Her description and the items I had seen matched the missing person case. I was asked for a formal statement. I provided one. But the rangers still couldn't find the campsite. They searched the area extensively with a team, using dogs and modern equipment, and found nothing: no tent, no backpack, no scattered clothing, just pristine forest. What disturbs me most is that the missing person report indicated Rebecca had vanished 3 days before. I even arrived at the trailhead. She had been reported missing on Thursday. I didn't arrive at the Lewis River Trail until Saturday afternoon. Yet I found her campsite, apparently abandoned, but with evidence of recent struggle. I found her belongings. I found drag marks in fresh soil. I found physical evidence on my own body that matched the campsite location. But according to the official timeline, she had already been missing for 3 days before I arrived. I don't know how to reconcile this contradiction. I don't know if I actually saw her campsite, or if something else entirely happened. I don't know if the forest was showing me something that had already occurred, or if time in that location worked differently than it should. I know what I saw in those photographs. I know that soil is still under my fingernails. In those images, I know that something happened on the Lewis River Trail that defies explanation. The most disturbing detail is something I only remembered later. While the search team was looking for the campsite, I kept hearing a sound, a distant rhythmic flapping sound, like canvas flapping in a strong wind. The sound kept coming from the forest around me, from different directions, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. The rangers didn't seem to hear it, or if they did, they didn't acknowledge it. I heard it for hours, long after the search was called off, long after I had hiked back to the trailhead. Even driving away in my car, I thought I could still hear it, that distant flapping sound echoing from somewhere I couldn't see. My name is Willow. I'm a 38-year-old experienced solo hiker, and I run a trail blog where I document my hiking experiences across the Pacific Northwest. I've logged over 300 backpacking trips. I've done multi-day expeditions through wilderness areas that most people never venture into. I'm comfortable with solitude. I'm comfortable with remote terrain. I understand the risks of backcountry hiking, and I've never experienced anything that I couldn't eventually explain through some rational framework, until I hiked Eagle Creek Trail in the Columbia River Gorge, and the landscape itself seemed to deliberately violate the laws of physics. I arrived at the Eagle Creek Trailhead on a Thursday morning in late July. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, moderate temperature, visibility for miles. The parking lot was crowded with summer hikers, but I knew the further up the trail you go, the fewer people you encounter. I had planned a 12-mile out-and-back hike, reaching as far as I could comfortably go before turning around and heading back to the parking area. My fitness tracker was set. My hydration system was full. My camera was charged, and I was excited to capture some photographs for my blog. I started hiking at 8:47 a.m., documenting the time in my trail log. The trail initially follows Eagle Creek, passing through dense, old-growth forest with massive Douglas fir and western hemlock. You can hear the creek constantly, feel the mist from the numerous small waterfalls that cascade down the cliff faces on either side of the trail. The air smells like pine and damp earth, like water and living moss. The Columbia River Gorge creates its own unique microclimate. The canyon shape funnels wind and moisture in ways that create otherworldly atmospheric conditions. Around mile 2, I reach the first major landmark, Punch Bowl Falls. This is one of the most iconic waterfalls in the entire gorge, a perfect 100-foot cascade that spills into a brilliant blue-green pool surrounded by basalt cliffs and ancient forest. I stopped here for about 20 minutes, documenting the location with photos and video, checking my fitness tracker to confirm my distance. The tracker showed I was exactly at 2.1 miles, matching the official trail guidebooks. Everything was normal. Everything was right on schedule. I continued past Punch Bowl Falls, the trail becoming somewhat steeper as it climbed deeper into the canyon. The elevation gain was manageable, and I was making good time. I reached High Bridge, another famous landmark, around mile 3.2. High Bridge is an iron structure that crosses a dramatic gorge 150 feet above the creek below. It's technically accessible but somewhat intimidating. You cross it on a narrow metal walkway with cables bolted into the cliff for handholds. I crossed it carefully, aware of the exposure beneath my feet, but I'd crossed many such structures before. After High Bridge, I continued up the trail, heading toward Tunnel Falls, the next major destination. This section is less crowded, more remote, and the trail becomes increasingly carved into the cliff face. I was making steady progress, or so I thought. I was enjoying the solitude, the natural beauty, the perfect weather. Around what I estimated to be mile 5 on the trail, I noticed something odd. I passed Punch Bowl Falls again. At first, I thought I had somehow looped back. I checked my fitness tracker. It showed I was at mile 0.3, which was near the trailhead. My brain couldn't process this contradiction. I was clearly at Punch Bowl Falls. I was standing in front of the distinctive waterfall, the same blue-green pool, the same basalt grotto. I was certain of the location, but my tracker said I was near the parking lot. My GPS showed coordinates that made no sense in relation to where I was standing. I consulted my phone's GPS as a backup. It also showed contradictory information. I sat down on a rock and tried to think clearly. Maybe I had become confused about the trail layout. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn. Maybe my GPS devices were malfunctioning. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps. I would hike back down the trail, return to the parking area, recalibrate my devices, and start again. I felt a slight sense of frustration, but nothing alarming, just a technical difficulty that needed to be resolved. So I began hiking downhill. I should have been retracing my path back toward the trailhead. But as I walked, I realized the trail wasn't going downhill. It was going uphill. I was ascending, not descending. I could feel my muscles working harder, my breathing becoming deeper, my heart rate increasing. Yet I was absolutely certain I was walking in the direction I had come from. I could see the trail markings. The landscape matched my memory of hiking up, but the topography was wrong. Then I encountered another group of hikers, 3 people coming down the trail. I stopped them and asked where they were headed. They said they had been hiking uphill for hours, working their way up to the higher elevations pushing toward Wattom Lake. But they were walking downhill. They were descending. They were moving in a downslope direction. They were clearly going down the mountain. Yet they insisted they'd been climbing for hours. I looked at them confused, but they seemed certain of their own account. We exchanged a few more words, but I could see they were skeptical of me, skeptical of something. and I let them continue past me. I continued hiking, and the landscape became increasingly disorienting. I would reach Punchbowl Falls again, then High Bridge, then unfamiliar sections of trail, then back to Punchbowl Falls. The landmarks appeared in reverse order. I was seeing High Bridge, and then Punchbowl Falls repeatedly. I was encountering the same geographical features in the wrong sequence. When I should have been progressing up the trail toward Tunnel Falls, I was cycling through earlier landmarks, seeing them in reverse chronological order. The trail itself seemed to be actively inverting its geography. Throughout this entire experience, the wind never stopped blowing. There was a constant, powerful wind that always blew directly into my face, regardless of which direction I was walking. When I attempted to walk downhill, the wind came from downhill. When I turned around and walked uphill, the wind came from uphill. It was always directly opposing my direction of travel. And embedded in that wind sound was something else, what sounded like whispers, like voices speaking backwards, like reversed audio. The wind itself seemed to be trying to communicate something, to convey information I couldn't quite decode. I kept walking, kept trying to make progress, kept hoping that eventually I would reach either the parking lot or Tunnel Falls, or some point of clarity where the trail would make logical sense again. But the hours passed, and I was still cycling through the same landmarks. I was still hearing that wind with its embedded reversed whispers. My fitness tracker showed increasingly impossible numbers, distances that didn't correspond to anything I could understand. Eventually, after what felt like 11 hours, maybe longer, the landscape stabilized. I reached the parking lot. My car was where I had left it. The parking lot was still relatively full with other vehicles. Everything was normal. I was utterly exhausted. My legs felt like they had climbed a mountain. Every muscle was screaming with fatigue. My mind felt fractured, confused, unable to process the experience I had just undergone. I sat in my car and reviewed my fitness tracker data. The tracker showed I had hiked 47 miles during that time, 47 miles on a 12-mile trail. The data didn't make sense. I transferred the data to my computer when I got home, hoping to review it in more detail, but the file was corrupted. The GPS information wouldn't load properly. The fitness tracker itself began malfunctioning after that day. It would turn on intermittently and display garbled numbers before shutting down again. I've hiked Eagle Creek Trail several times since that experience, and it has always behaved normally. The landmarks appear in the correct sequence. The elevation gains match the guidebooks. The distance is accurate. The wind blows from changing directions, and I don't hear any strange whispered sounds. But I remember that day. I remember the impossible backwards geography. I remember the wind that always opposed me. I remember the whispers in that wind. And most of all, I remember the feeling that the trail wasn't broken, that I wasn't lost, that the landscape itself was actively working against me, deliberately reversing its own geography to prevent me from progressing. I've never written about this experience on my blog. I've documented hundreds of hikes over the years, but this one remains private, hidden away in my personal records. I'm afraid that sharing it would damage my credibility as a trail guide and outdoor educator. I'm afraid that writing about it would make it feel more real, and some part of me still wants to believe it was a hallucination or heat stroke or some other rational explanation. But on cold, quiet nights, when I'm alone, I think about that wind and those whispers, and I wonder if the gorge was trying to tell me something that day, something important, something dangerous. My name is Arlo, and I'm a 45-year-old geology professor at a university in Washington. I have a doctorate in structural geology and mineralogy, and I also pursue photography as a serious hobby. I've studied geological phenomena across the Pacific Northwest for 2 decades. I understand how lakes form, how they persist, how they drain. I understand groundwater systems, lava tubes, percolation rates, seasonal water tables. Everything I'm about to tell you violates my understanding of how geology actually works, and I'm sharing it because I need someone else to confirm that I didn't hallucinate the entire experience. I had learned about South Prairie Lake through academic literature. It's a geological oddity, a seasonal lake in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest that appears each spring around 85 acres of water formed by snowmelt and seasonal rainfall, and disappears over the course of weeks or months as the water drains through lava tubes in the bedrock. The mechanism is fascinating from a geological standpoint. Ice that freezes in the lava tubes acts like a plug, preventing water from draining until the ice melts and allows the water to percolate downward into the porous volcanic rock. I had read the scientific literature on the phenomenon, and I wanted to document it photographically, while also examining the geological structures that create this unusual behavior. I planned a trip to South Prairie Lake in late May, a time when the lake should be at or near its maximum extent. The drive from Willard was straightforward. Following Forest Road 66 into the remote area where the meadow is located, I arrived at the access point around 8:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning. The day was absolutely perfect. Clear skies, moderate temperature, excellent visibility. I was alone at the location, no other vehicles, no other visitors. I packed my kayak and set up a basic camp near the shore. I spent about 2 hours on the water, paddling across the lake and photographing the old-growth cottonwoods and lodgepole pines that rose up through the water. The light was spectacular. The reflections on the glassy surface were perfect. The water itself was an unusual shade of blue-green, colored by the suspended sediment and organic matter that filled it. Everything was exactly as I had expected based on the photographs and descriptions I had read in scientific papers. After paddling, I beached the kayak and decided to hike inland to a higher elevation viewpoint. I wanted to photograph the lake from above, to document its extent and boundaries from a different perspective. I left my kayak pulled up on shore, along with my camping gear, my backpack, my camera equipment. I hiked about a quarter-mile inland, climbing gradually to a ridge that provided views back down toward the lake. The hike took me about 10 to 15 minutes, and once I reached the viewpoint, I spent about 30 minutes photographing the lake from this elevated perspective. During this time, I was wading in the shallow water near shore, and I felt moisture soaking into my boots, felt the weight of water on my pant legs. I was intentionally walking through the shallows to photograph the reflections and the transition zone between water and land. My boots were absolutely soaked. My socks were wet. My pant legs were dripping. I was fully aware of this moisture accumulating on my body and clothing. When I finished photographing from the ridge, I decided to return to my camp. The return hike took approximately 45 minutes. I was moving slowly, enjoying the landscape, not in any rush. When I reached the location where I had left my kayak and camping gear, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The lake was gone. Completely gone. No water. No lake. Just a dry meadow with chest-high grass and wildflowers. The shoreline where I had been paddling 45 minutes earlier had simply vanished. My kayak was now sitting in the middle of a dry meadow, 200 feet from the nearest tree line. My camping gear was also in the middle of this meadow, appearing completely out of place, isolated in the grassland. I approached my equipment slowly, trying to understand what was happening. My boots, which had been soaked when I began hiking, were completely dry, bone dry. There was no moisture on them, no water dripping from my pant legs. My socks were dry, my pants were dry, everything was dry. I looked down at the grass immediately surrounding my kayak and camping gear. It was completely dry, no mud, no watermarks, no evidence that water had been there moments before. I checked my camera, reviewing the photographs I had taken from the elevated viewpoint. Every image clearly showed the lake, 85 acres of water with perfect reflections. The timestamps on the photos showed they were taken 45 minutes ago. There was no doubt about what I had captured. The lake had existed at that time. It had been real. I looked around at the meadow, and then I noticed something else. Driftwood. Ancient weathered driftwood scattered throughout the grass, exactly where the shoreline had been just moments before. The wood was bleached by sun and age, covered in lichen, appearing as if it had been there for decades. The grain was cracked and weathered. The pieces were fragile. They looked like they had been deposited by water that retreated years or decades ago, not minutes ago. I walked around the meadow in a daze, trying to understand what I was experiencing. I picked up one piece of driftwood, and it crumbled in my hands. The wood was that old, that weathered, that fragile from age. I checked my watch repeatedly, confirming the time. I reviewed my camera timestamps again, confirming the gap of 45 minutes between the elevated photographs and my return to the meadow. I called the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest Ranger Station from my emergency radio. I reported that South Prairie Lake had disappeared, that I had paddled on the lake this morning, documented it photographically, and now, less than an hour later, it had simply vanished. The ranger on duty seemed skeptical. They explained to me that South Prairie Lake does drain seasonally, but the process takes weeks or months, not hours or minutes. They suggested that perhaps I was confused about the location, or perhaps I had imagined the initial water. I hiked back to my vehicle and drove to the ranger station. I showed them my photographs on my camera. The images clearly documented the lake's existence that morning. The timestamps proved that less than 1 hour had passed between the elevated photographs and when the lake disappeared. The ranger examined the photos carefully, and I could see their expression change from skepticism to confusion. They drove back to South Prairie with me, and we approached the meadow from the access road. At that point in the day, it was around 2:30 p.m. The meadow was completely dry, just grass and wildflowers and scattered driftwood. The ranger confirmed that the lake had actually been present that morning. Other visitors had seen it. It had been documented, but now it was gone. They examined the ground around where my kayak sat, finding no evidence of recent water, no mud, no moisture, nothing to indicate that water had been there recently. I showed the ranger the driftwood, the ancient weathered pieces scattered throughout the meadow. The ranger looked confused. They said that yes, driftwood does appear in this meadow, but it's from water that existed years ago, from previous seasons when the lake persisted longer. This driftwood was ancient, had been there for seasons, but I know what I saw. I know that driftwood pattern was new, fresh to that location. I know my boots went from soaking wet to bone dry. I know my camera timestamps proved the lake existed 90 minutes earlier. I know that my understanding of hydrology and geological processes cannot explain what happened. I submitted a formal report to the Forest Service, documenting everything that occurred. I provided my photographs as evidence. I provided my camera's metadata as proof of the timeline. I provided my own eyewitness testimony. The report was filed, but no explanation was ever provided. No geological analysis was performed. No investigation was conducted. It was as if the Forest Service simply accepted that something impossible had occurred and chose not to pursue it. I haven't returned to South Prairie Lake since that day. Every geology textbook I consulted after that experience confirmed that lakes don't disappear in 45 minutes, that driftwood doesn't age decades in a few hours, that soaked clothing doesn't dry instantaneously without sun or wind. I have no explanation for what happened, and I've resigned myself to carrying this experience as a mystery that I simply cannot solve. My name is Elliot. I'm a 31-year-old park naturalist and professional wildlife sound recorder, and I spend most of my professional life documenting ambient forest sounds for nature documentaries and educational projects. I have years of experience with audio equipment, signal processing, acoustic ecology, and field recording methodology. I understand how sound behaves in different environments. I understand the technical specifications of recording equipment. I understand frequency ranges and human hearing thresholds. which is exactly why what happened to me near Lake Quinault terrifies me more than any traditional ghost story ever could. I had been commissioned by a production company to record ambient sounds from the Quinault rainforest for a documentary about the Olympic Peninsula's ecosystems. The goal was to capture authentic forest ambience, capturing layers of sound that would transport viewers into the experience of being inside old-growth rainforest. I had planned 3 weeks in the field, setting up recording stations at different locations, capturing different times of day, different weather conditions, building a comprehensive audio library of the forest's natural soundscape. I arrived at the Quinault rainforest area in early September, bringing with me professional-grade recording equipment. I had multiple directional microphones, windscreens, audio interfaces, backup power systems, and redundant storage for all recorded material. I set up my base camp near Lake Quinault, in a sheltered area protected from heavy wind, and began my systematic recording work. The first week went perfectly. I was capturing incredible sounds, the ambient forest hum, bird calls, the sound of rain on different tree species, creek water flowing over rocks, wind moving through different forest strata. I was particularly interested in recording near the area known as the Miracle Acre, a section of the rainforest with record-breaking concentrations of old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar. This area had survived the tragic event of 2018, when hundreds of ancient trees had mysteriously fallen in a localized area. No clear meteorological explanation, no evidence of disease or insect damage. They had simply been snapped like toothpicks. Locals whispered about the event, some claiming they had heard unusual sounds preceding the fall. Ground sounds, they called them. Vibrations that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. During the second week of my recording project, I began setting up recording stations in the Miracle Acre area. I wanted to capture the unique acoustic properties of this dense old-growth forest, trees so large and so close together that sound behaves differently than in other forest types. I was excited about the potential recordings. I set up my directional mics on tripods, positioned them to capture different sound angles, and started the recording sessions at dawn, letting the equipment run for 8 to 10 hours at a time. When I returned to collect the first day's recordings and reviewed them at my campsite, I immediately noticed something unusual in the audio files. Beneath all the natural forest sounds, beneath the bird calls and wind and ambient noise, there was a low-frequency hum, a subsonic or near-subsonic tone running underneath the entire recording. The hum was subtle. You wouldn't necessarily notice it unless you were actively listening for it, but once you detected it, it became impossible to ignore. I listened to multiple hours of the recording, and the hum was constant, present in every moment, running like an underlying drone beneath the natural forest sounds. I checked my equipment, wondering if something was malfunctioning, if perhaps an electronic component was producing the artifact. I recalibrated the microphones, changed the recording settings, moved to a different location within the Miracle Acre, and recorded again the next day. When I reviewed the second day's recordings, the hum was still there, identical in pitch and character, underlying all the natural sounds. I tried different microphones, different recording interfaces, different locations, and every recording contained the same mysterious hum. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. The hum seemed to follow my movements through the forest. I would record at one location in the morning, and the hum would be present. I would move to a completely different location a quarter mile away, and the same hum would be present again. When I reviewed multiple recordings from the same day, I could identify when I had moved because the ambient background sounds changed, but the hum remained constant, identical, persistent. It was like the hum was traveling with me, moving as I moved, anchored to my location. Regardless of where I went in the forest, I brought one of my recordings to my portable audio editing setup and began analyzing the waveform data in detail. I discovered something impossible. The hum's frequency pattern matched my walking rhythm exactly. When I was stationary in the recording, the hum continued, but at a steady, consistent level. But when I was moving, when I was actively walking through the forest to reach different recording locations, the hum changed its pattern. It pulsed in synchronization with my footsteps, like a heartbeat that matched my pace. When I walked faster, the hum's rhythm accelerated. When I slowed down, the rhythm decreased. I decided to conduct an experiment. I would record a control session where I remained completely stationary, then immediately record another session where I deliberately walked in a specific pattern. If the hum was truly responsive to my movement, I should be able to document this behavior clearly. I set up my recording equipment at a fixed location near Lake Cano, recorded for 30 minutes while standing absolutely still, then immediately recorded another 30-minute session while walking a deliberate circuit around the recording location. When I reviewed the files, the effect was undeniable. The stationary recording had the hum at a constant frequency. The movement recording had the hum pulsing and varying in rhythm with my footsteps. I was disturbed enough by these findings to reach out to colleagues at the university. I sent copies of my recordings and my analysis data to the acoustics department, asking for an independent examination of the phenomenon. A team of 3 audio engineers examined the files, conducted their own analysis, and were equally baffled. They confirmed that the hum was real, recorded by multiple microphone arrays, not an artifact of any single device. They confirmed that the frequency analysis showed the hum responded to my movement. They confirmed that the hum was occupying a frequency range below normal human hearing capability, between 10 and 20 hertz. Yet somehow my recording equipment had captured it clearly. One detail from their analysis particularly disturbed me. When they performed spatial localization analysis on the recorded hum, attempting to determine its origin point in 3-dimensional space, they found something impossible. The sound source analysis indicated the hum was coming from a location less than 6 feet away from the recording microphone. The hum's acoustic properties suggested it was originating from directly above the microphone, at approximately the height of a human head. I had brought my recording equipment with me into the forest. I had recorded it in outdoor locations with no enclosed spaces, with multiple recording points spread across the Miracle Acre area. Yet the analysis consistently indicated the sound source was approximately 6 feet away, approximately at head height. The analysis essentially suggested the sound was coming from inside my body, or from somewhere immediately adjacent to my body. The university team invited me to bring my equipment to their laboratory for further analysis. I packed up my recording gear and drove to campus. They conducted a comprehensive examination of all my equipment, testing every component, checking for electrical problems, inspecting for damage, and found nothing abnormal. Every piece of equipment was functioning within normal specifications. There were no malfunctions, no hardware problems, nothing that would explain how the equipment was capturing sounds from an impossible location. During our laboratory session, the team attempted to record new audio files using my equipment in their acoustic lab, where background noise was minimized and controlled. They set up my microphones in the soundproof recording chamber, and we attempted to capture any sound artifact that might be produced by the equipment itself. The chamber was completely silent, specifically designed to eliminate external sound. We recorded for 15 minutes with no activity in the chamber, just silence. When we reviewed the recording, the low-frequency hum was there, present in the absolutely silent, soundproof chamber, recorded by equipment that should not be picking up any external sound source. That's when I realized something deeply unsettling. The hum wasn't coming from outside my equipment. It wasn't a property of the forest or the environment. It was something intrinsic to my recording equipment, or perhaps to me. Perhaps the equipment was just capturing something that was actually present in my physical body or my immediate proximity. I discontinued my recording project and returned home. I couldn't continue working in the Quinaulta rainforest, knowing that something anomalous was happening, something that defied all conventional explanation. I stopped using the affected recording equipment. I tried replacing individual components, but any recording I made seemed to produce the same hum, as if the phenomenon was somehow traveling with me, attached to me, independent of which specific microphone or interface I was using. What troubles me most are the details I learned later about the 2018 tree fall event. Locals, who had been present in the forest when the trees suddenly collapsed, reported hearing a low-frequency sound preceding the event. A ground sound, they said, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the earth itself. From all the descriptions I gathered, that sound matched the characteristics of the hum I had recorded. The same frequency range, the same impossible acoustic properties, the same sense of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I haven't returned to the Quinaulta rainforest since that experience. I've essentially abandoned my career in wildlife sound recording. I can't work in forests anymore without wondering if the hum is still there, waiting, following, attached to me in some way I don't understand. And I absolutely cannot explain to potential employers or colleagues why I've stopped recording ambient sound entirely. My name is Riley. I'm a 27-year-old conservation volunteer, and I had been working with the National Park Service for 3 seasons, conducting trail maintenance and conservation work throughout Mount Rainier National Park. I had hiked the Wonderland Trail before, the complete 93-mile circuit that circumnavigates Mount Rainier, and I thought I knew the trail well enough to attempt a faster through hike during a window of time when I had personal leave available from my job. I planned a 10-day trip to complete the entire circuit at a moderate pace, breaking it into reasonable daily segments. I was an experienced backpacker, comfortable with navigation, confident in my physical abilities, completely unprepared for the trail to literally grow beneath my feet. I started the Wonderland Trail at the Longmire Trailhead on a clear morning in late August. The weather forecast was excellent. No rain expected. Mild temperatures. Visibility for miles. I had my GPS tracker fully charged, backup batteries, detailed topographic maps, and a permit for my planned itinerary. My first day was uneventful. I hiked approximately 8 miles, reaching my planned campsite at Cougar Camp right on schedule. Day 2 was also straightforward. I covered the planned distance, camped at Moraine Park. Everything was progressing normally. Day 3 was supposed to be the easiest segment of my entire Wonderland Trail experience. The official guidebooks and my detailed planning indicated it should be 8.2 miles from Moraine Park to White River Camp. Mild elevation gain, mostly following river valleys, and established trail through lower elevation forest. I wasn't expecting any difficulties. I had started at 7 a.m., timing myself to arrive at White River Camp by mid-afternoon, giving myself plenty of daylight to set up camp and prepare for the next day. After my first 2 hours of hiking, my GPS showed I had covered 1.9 miles, right on pace. I felt good. The weather was perfect. The trail was in excellent condition. I was moving efficiently, passing through a section of dense forest along the Nisqually River. The trail clearly marked, well maintained. I could see no sign of anything unusual or problematic. Around the 3-hour mark, I checked my GPS again and had covered 3.2 miles, slightly behind schedule but nothing concerning. I could easily make up the time. My legs felt strong. My breathing was steady. But then I noticed something odd. The next segment of trail between 2 creek crossings should have been approximately 0.5 miles. According to my map, I carefully noted where I started this segment by marking a reference point. I hiked what I estimated to be about 5 minutes, roughly equivalent to half a mile at my normal pace, and reached the second creek. But when I checked my GPS, the device indicated I had traveled 2.1 miles, not the expected 0.5 miles. The creek crossings were in the correct location. The landmarks matched my map, but the distance between them had expanded massively. I sat down on a boulder and tried to process this information. I recalibrated my GPS, checked the elevation reading, verified that I was at the correct location coordinates. Everything confirmed I was exactly where I should be on the trail, but the distance traveled was completely wrong. I assumed the GPS had malfunctioned, so I noted the time and restarted the tracking. I would hike the next segment and carefully monitor the distance reading. The next segment should have taken me to a distinctive bridge crossing, marked on my map as being 0.7 miles further. I hiked what felt like approximately 7 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, and reached the bridge. When I checked my GPS, it showed I had traveled 2.3 miles. I was deeply confused now. Something was fundamentally wrong with either my navigation or my understanding of distance and time. I sat on the bridge and reviewed all my maps and GPS readings carefully. The GPS coordinates and altitude readings all confirmed I was exactly where the map said I should be. My location was correct. The landmarks were correct. But the distances were all wrong. They were all stretched, elongated. The segments that should have taken 30 to 40 minutes were now taking the same amount of time, but supposedly covering distances of 2 to 3 miles. Around mid-afternoon, I encountered another hiker on the trail, a man who appeared to be in his 50s, moving in the opposite direction, coming down the trail toward me. I immediately asked him about the trail distances. I asked if he had noticed anything unusual about the segments he'd just hiked. If his GPS was showing normal readings, he said his GPS had been acting strange all morning, showing inconsistent distances, but he'd figured it was a malfunction. I compared my GPS log to his, and we discovered something truly disturbing. The same trail segment measured different distances depending on which direction we had traveled through it. The segment I had hiked, going clockwise around the mountain, showed 2.1 miles on my GPS, but when he had hiked the same segment going counterclockwise earlier, his GPS had recorded it as only 1.8 miles. Neither reading matched the map's 0.5-mile distance. We couldn't explain it. We compared notes, speculated about GPS signal problems or atmospheric interference from the mountain's glaciers, but nothing we discussed made logical sense. I asked him how long he had been hiking. He said 8 hours. He checked his distance tracker, and it showed 14.7 miles covered, much more than he had planned to hike. He seemed as disturbed by this as I was. We parted ways, both confused, both uncertain what was happening. I continued hiking, and the strange distance distortions continued throughout the afternoon. Every segment of trail was elongated, stretched, measured as significantly longer than the map indicated. Yet I was passing all the correct landmarks, all the correct features. At the correct locations, I was somehow traveling. Distances that didn't match the geography of the landscape. Mount Rainier's constant glacial melt creates a low-frequency rumbling sound, a subsonic vibration that reverberates through the mountain and can be felt through the ground as you hike. It's a natural acoustic phenomenon that most hikers barely notice, a background presence in the environment. But during the most severely stretched sections of trail, I became acutely aware of this vibration. I could feel it coming through my boots, a rhythmic rumbling that seemed to match my heartbeat exactly. Every time my heart would accelerate from exertion, the ground vibration would accelerate with it. When I slowed my pace, the vibration would slow simultaneously. My body's internal rhythm seemed to be synchronized with the mountain's own vibrations. I reached White River Camp after 14 hours of hiking. My GPS log showed I had covered 19.7 miles during a segment that was officially documented as 8.2 miles. I was exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced on previous backpacking trips. My legs felt like they had climbed a mountain. My feet were blistered. My mind was reeling from the impossibility of what I had experienced. I set up camp and immediately downloaded my GPS data to my backup device, creating a complete record of the day's anomalies. I reviewed the information repeatedly, trying to identify any rational explanation, but the data was undeniable. I had traveled nearly 20 miles in the time it should have taken to travel 8 miles, while passing all the same landmarks in the correct sequence. The next morning, I hiked an additional 5 miles to verify whether the phenomena would continue. The distances on day 4 were normal. They matched the maps. They made sense. No more stretching. No more impossible distance measurements. The mountain had returned to normal geography. The remaining 6 days of my Wonderland Trail experience were completely uneventful. All distances matched the maps perfectly. All hiking times aligned with planning and expectations. When I returned to civilization and reviewed my data with park rangers and GPS specialists, they couldn't explain the anomalies. One ranger mentioned that she had heard reports from 2 other hikers over the past year who had experienced similar phenomena on the same day, 3 segment of the Wonderland Trail. Both reports had been dismissed as GPS malfunctions or hiker confusion, but 3 independent reports of the same problem on the same trail section seemed significant, seemed like something worth investigating. Yet, as far as I know, no investigation was ever conducted. I've hiked sections of the Wonderland Trail several times since that experience, specifically trying to return to that same day 3 segment to see if the phenomena would repeat. But every time I hike it, the distances are normal, the trail behaves properly. The GPS readings align with the maps. It's only that one experience that defies explanation, that one day when the trail grew beneath my feet, when I traveled distances that shouldn't have existed, when my body's rhythm synchronized with the mountain's ancient vibrations. I still hike regularly. I still work in conservation, but I approach the Wonderland Trail with a new respect now, a recognition that there's something about that particular segment of trail that operates on rules different from normal geography, something that selectively lengthens the path for certain hikers on certain days, and I have absolutely no idea why or how. My name is Hayden. I'm a 52-year-old former search and rescue volunteer, and I spent nearly 20 years conducting wilderness rescues and trail navigation training throughout the Olympic Peninsula and Cascade Mountains. I'm intimately familiar with how trails are documented, how they're maintained, how official records are kept. I understand GPS technology. I understand topographic maps. I understand the distinction between official trails and informal paths that develop over time. I have degrees in geography and emergency management. My career was built on precise navigation and accurate information, which is exactly why what happened to me on the North Fork Skokomish Trail has destabilized my entire understanding of how reliable documentation and historical records actually are. My grandfather had been a ranger in the Olympic National Forest during the 1960s, and when he passed away several years ago, I inherited a collection of his personal items, including his original topographic maps from his decades of forestry work. These maps were fascinating historical documents, showing the forest as it existed 50 years ago, marked with his personal notes about trails, campsites, wildlife observations, and various landmarks. I began cross-referencing these old maps with modern GPS technology and contemporary Forest Service documentation. Most information aligned well, but I noticed one interesting discrepancy on one of my grandfather's maps. The map showed a trail junction labeled North Crossing, located approximately 2.3 miles up the North Fork Skokomish Trail from the Staircase Ranger Station. This junction didn't appear on any modern maps I consulted. It didn't appear in current Forest Service documentation. It wasn't mentioned in hiking guides or trail databases. I became curious about this missing junction. I wondered if it had been abandoned and removed from records, or if perhaps the junction had never actually existed and was a mistake on my grandfather's map. I decided to investigate. I planned a hiking trip to that specific location, using my grandfather's 1960s coordinates combined with modern GPS technology to pinpoint where this north crossing should be located. If it existed, I wanted to document it. If it didn't exist, I wanted to understand why it had been mapped. I arrived at the Staircase Ranger Station on a crisp October morning. The weather was perfect, clear skies, dry conditions, mild temperature. I checked in at the ranger station, mentioned my grandfather's former employment there, and asked if anyone had any knowledge of a trail junction called North Crossing. The rangers looked at their documentation and found nothing. They suggested that perhaps my grandfather's map contained an error, or perhaps the junction had been abandoned and removed decades ago. No one had any information about it. I began my hike up the North Fork Skokomish Trail, following the established trail, passing the standard landmarks, Big Log, Camp, Pleasant. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked. I hiked for approximately 2.3 miles and reached the approximate coordinates where North Crossing should be located, according to my grandfather's map. I paused and examined the forest carefully, looking for any sign of a trail junction, any evidence of an old trail split. Then I saw it. Partially obscured by encroaching vegetation, a barely visible trail split. The main trail continued in one direction, but another path diverged off to the right. It was heavily overgrown, obviously not maintained, but distinctly a trail. There was even a weathered wooden sign, barely legible, reading North Crossing. 3 km de Messetries. The paint was completely faded, the wood was bleached and splintered, but the sign was unmistakably there. I had found something that supposedly didn't exist. I was excited. I followed the North Crossing Trail for approximately 1.5 miles, documenting everything with photographs and GPS coordinates. The trail was indeed abandoned and heavily overgrown, but it was definitely a maintained trail at some point in the past. I encountered infrastructure that confirmed this. Old concrete survey markers embedded in the ground, rusted metal equipment that appeared to be old trail construction equipment, established campsites that showed evidence of age. The deeper I hiked, the more evidence I found of what had been a legitimate established trail system that was now completely abandoned and unmaintained. I photographed everything, marked GPS coordinates, took video documentation. I was thrilled to discover this lost piece of forest history. I hiked back to the main trail and spent the remainder of my trip documenting the discovery. When I returned to the Staircase Ranger Station, I told the rangers what I had found. I showed them photographs. I provided GPS coordinates. I offered to lead them to the junction. The rangers seemed skeptical. They suggested I might have misidentified standard trail features as a junction. They didn't seem particularly interested in investigating further. I decided that I needed better documentation. I returned 3 days later with 3 friends, all experienced hikers and outdoor enthusiasts. My plan was to show them the junction, have them verify that it existed, and then hike the North Crossing Trail together to document it more thoroughly. We hiked to the location where I had found the junction, 2.3 miles up the North Fork Skokomish Trail. Reaching the approximate GPS coordinates, I was confident I would show my friends exactly what I had found. But when we reached that location, the junction was gone. There was no trail split, no overgrown path, no weathered sign, just dense, undisturbed old-growth forest. I looked at my GPS unit. The coordinates matched. I was in exactly the right location, but the trail junction had simply vanished. My friends looked at me with expressions ranging from confusion to skepticism. I insisted we search the area. I looked for any evidence of the infrastructure I had seen, the survey markers, the rusted equipment, anything. We searched for an hour and found absolutely nothing. I showed my friends the photographs on my camera. The images clearly documented the trail junction, the weathered North Crossing sign, the survey markers, the rusted equipment. Everything was clearly visible in the photographs, taken just 3 days earlier. But when I looked at the GPS metadata embedded in the photographs, something was wrong. The GPS coordinates in the photo metadata didn't match the coordinates from my GPS unit. The photos appeared to have been taken at a different location entirely, somewhere miles away from where I believed I had taken them. My friends became uncomfortable. One of them suggested that perhaps I had edited the photographs, that I was showing them doctored images. I insisted I hadn't altered anything, but even I began to doubt myself. The GPS metadata was undeniable. The location information in the photos didn't match my current location. It didn't match any location I could identify. The coordinates placed the photos somewhere in the middle of impassable terrain, impossible territory where the photographs couldn't possibly have been taken. I reported the discovery to the Forest Service, providing my photographs and GPS coordinates. The rangers examined everything and concluded that I had either misidentified my location when taking the photographs, or that I had somehow confused information from different hikes. They found no evidence of a trail junction at the location I specified. They found no records of anything called North Crossing ever existing in the modern or historical record. They suggested that perhaps my grandfather's map contained errors, or perhaps I had misread the map entirely. I returned alone several more times trying to relocate the trail junction, trying to find any evidence that it had existed, but it never appeared again. I searched my grandfather's original map for any other notations or information about North Crossing, and I found very little, just the label and the location marking, no description, no context, no explanation of what this junction connected to. What troubles me most about this experience is the Douglas fir trees in that area. The forest surrounding the location where the junction appeared and then disappeared is notably unusual. All the trees in that specific area are virtually identical in diameter and height, as if the entire stand had been planted at the same time and grown at exactly the same rate. This uniformity is extremely rare in old-growth forest, where trees of varying ages and sizes typically intermingle. Yet these trees all appeared to be exactly the same size, which was also puzzling because the dense forest floor vegetation suggested these trees were ancient, probably 3 to 4 centuries old. Yet they had all achieved identical dimensions, which shouldn't be possible. I had a forestry student take core samples from several of these uniform trees to verify their age. The analysis confirmed my suspicion. Each tree sampled was between 300 and 380 years old, yet they were all within a few inches of the same height and diameter. That level of uniformity in a forest stand of that age is essentially impossible under natural conditions. I've never been able to adequately explain what I experienced. I have the photographs as evidence. I have GPS coordinates. I have my grandfather's historical map showing the junction. Yet I cannot locate it again, cannot prove it exists or ever existed. My friends insist the photographs have been manipulated, even though I know they haven't been altered. The Forest Service has no record of North Crossing ever existing. Yet my grandfather documented it 60 years ago. The trees in that area defy normal growth patterns with their impossible uniformity. Sometimes I wonder if what I encountered was a trail that existed in my grandfather's time, but has been somehow erased from the present day. Not just abandoned and overgrown, but literally removed from physical reality. Or perhaps I encountered a trail that exists in the forest memory, in some layer of history that the landscape preserves but refuses to fully reveal to the modern world. My name is Amelia, and I'm a 36-year-old emergency dispatcher for a county 911 center in Washington State. I've answered approximately 15,000 emergency calls over my career. I've listened to screams. I've heard panic. I've documented people describing the worst moments of their lives. I'm trained to identify and categorize sounds, to determine urgency levels, to distinguish genuine distress from panic attacks. I understand the acoustic properties of human vocalization. I understand how different emotional states produce different tonal qualities in voice, which is precisely why, What happened to me at Taklak Lake terrifies me on a level that most people cannot comprehend, because I can identify impossible audio patterns, and what I heard that night should not exist. I had taken a solo camping trip to Taklak Lake in late August to decompress after a particularly stressful month of work. I had experienced several high-profile emergency calls, situations where I had to help coordinate responses to critical incidents, and I needed solitude to process the experience. Taklak Lake is located at 4,400 feet elevation in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, nestled at the base of Mount Adams. The views are spectacular, the camping area is serene, and it provided exactly the escape I needed. I had reserved a dispersed camping spot near the lake, with a clear view of Mount Adams silhouetted against the evening sky. I arrived on a Friday afternoon and set up my camp. I had brought my professional-grade audio recorder, a device I use for personal documentation, and occasionally for recreational sound recording. I had also brought a portable voice recorder that I use for taking notes and recording observations. I set up camp as the sun was setting, prepared a simple dinner, and spent the evening watching the last light fade from the mountain. The night was clear, stars were visible, and the atmosphere was peaceful and quiet. Around 11:43 p.m. I heard a scream. It came from somewhere distant to the northeast of my campsite, across the lake, toward the slopes of Mount Adams. The scream was clearly audible, despite the distance. A human voice, distinctly distressed, high-pitched, expressing what sounded like terror or extreme pain. My emergency responder instincts immediately activated. I grabbed my voice recorder and began documenting the sound. The scream lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then silence returned to the forest. The sound had come from the northeast, clearly audible but definitely distant, possibly a mile or more away. I waited, listening, wondering if I needed to report this. My cell phone had no signal, as was expected at this elevation in the forest. I had a satellite communicator, but I hesitated. Was the scream real, or had I imagined it? Was something actually wrong, or was this a wildlife sound I had misidentified? After about 5 minutes of silence, I heard the scream again. The second scream was identical to the first in every way. Same pitch, same duration, same cadence, same emotional tone. But this time it came from the due west of my position. From the opposite direction of the first scream, I checked my watch, 12:30 a.m. Exactly 47 minutes had elapsed between the first scream and the second. I documented this timing in my voice log. I was puzzled. 2 identical screams from different directions, exactly 47 minutes apart, didn't make logical sense, unless I was hearing an echo, but the intervals and directions didn't match echo behavior. At 1:17 a.m., the third scream came, this time from the southeast, again identical to the previous 2. Same audio signature, same duration, same exact cadence. 47 minutes had passed again. I was becoming frightened. I was also becoming acutely aware that something profoundly unusual was occurring. I documented every detail, the time, the direction, the quality of the sound. I checked my recording equipment to ensure everything was capturing properly. The audio files confirmed what my ears were hearing. The fourth scream came at 2:04 a.m., and this time it came from directly overhead, from somewhere within the forest canopy above my campsite. The sound was so close, so immediate, that I physically recoiled from it. It was identical to the previous screams, yet it seemed to come from directly above me. From within the trees surrounding my tent, I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. I shined my flashlight upward into the canopy but saw nothing. No person, no animal, nothing that could have produced the sound. 47 minutes later, at 2:51 a.m., the fifth scream came, but this time it was inside my tent, less than 3 feet away from me. The sound was so immediate, so proximate, that I felt the acoustic vibrations in my body. I screamed myself, a spontaneous reaction to pure terror. I stumbled backward, grabbed my backup voice recorder, confirmed it was running, and verified the timestamp. The scream lasted its usual 4 seconds. Then silence. I remained awake, trembling, checking my equipment repeatedly. I documented everything meticulously. The times, the directions of each sound, the audio files capturing each incident. At 3:38 a.m., 47 minutes after the tent scream, I expected to hear another. I had the pattern established in my mind now. I waited for it, prepared for it. My professional training was helping me maintain some level of composure, documenting the data even as my emotional state was deteriorating. But instead of waiting for another scream, I made the decision to leave. I packed my tent as rapidly as I could, threw my gear into my vehicle, and started driving down the mountain toward the ranger station. I was driving approximately 12 miles from Taklak Lake when I checked my vehicle clock. It read 3:38 a.m., the time when I had expected to hear the sixth scream. As if on cue, the scream came through my vehicle speakers. It played through my backup voice recorder, which was sitting on my passenger seat, still recording, still capturing audio. The device had captured another scream, identical to all the others, exactly 47 minutes after the fifth scream. Even though I was now miles away from the campsite, the device had been recording continuously, and the file timestamp confirmed it had captured this sixth scream at exactly 3:30 a.m. I continued driving and arrived at the ranger station around dawn. I was in a state of panic, adrenaline exhaustion, and emotional trauma. I reported everything to the rangers. I showed them my equipment. I played the audio files. I provided detailed documentation of times and directions. The rangers listened carefully, examined my recording equipment, and looked at my data. Then they checked for any reports of missing persons in the area. They found nothing. No missing hikers, no campers in distress, no reports of anyone missing. They searched the forest around Taklak Lake and found no evidence of distress or emergency. They listened to my audio recordings and confirmed that the screams were real, actually captured by my equipment. But they also confirmed something deeply disturbing. All 5 screams captured at Taklak Lake were absolutely identical. The ambient forest sounds in the background, the wind, the subtle forest ambience, everything was repeated identically in each scream. That level of identical repetition, including identical background noise profiles, should be mathematically impossible unless the exact same audio file was being played back repeatedly. The rangers brought in audio specialists from a regional agency who examined the recordings in detail. Their analysis confirmed what I had suspected. The screams were identical, which was impossible for 5 separate events recorded from different locations over a 68-minute period. The specialists suggested that perhaps I had somehow recorded the same audio event multiple times through some technical malfunction, but my equipment demonstrated no such issues. The specialists also noted something else. The scream audio contained very subtle background frequencies that didn't match any location near Taklak Lake. The acoustic signature suggested the scream originated from a completely different geographical location, yet it had been captured at Taklak Lake. I became intensely interested in the Yakama tribal history and legends about Mount Adams. The indigenous peoples have occupied this region for thousands of years, and they have extensive oral traditions about the mountain. One particular legend describes Mount Adams as a place where sounds echo through time rather than through space, where sounds become trapped in temporal loops, repeating on cycles that follow the mountain's own mysterious rhythm. Local elders spoke of the mountain having spiritual properties, of sounds that travel between moments rather than between locations, stories that seem like mythology until you've experienced something that contradicts everything you understand about how reality works. I've listened to the audio files hundreds of times since that night. I've analyzed them with professional audio software. I've examined every frequency component, every decibel level, every nuance of sound. The recordings are undeniable. The screams are real, captured by legitimate equipment. Yet they represent something that shouldn't exist. They represent sounds that violated the laws of physics, that repeated identically across space and time, that traveled 12 miles through air and vehicle speakers, that played on equipment that I own and can verify was functioning correctly. I don't know what was screaming that night. I don't know if it was a person or something else. I don't know if the screams were a physical phenomenon or something more subtle and mysterious. I only know that I have documented evidence of something that defies rational explanation, something that Mount atoms seem to be producing or facilitating, some acoustic phenomenon that seemed to fold time and space into repeating cycles of identical distress sounds. I've never returned to Taklak Lake, and I don't think I ever will. My career as an emergency dispatcher has continued, but my certainty about reality has been fundamentally altered. I hear emergency calls with a different awareness now, understanding that sometimes what people are reporting might be real even when it violates the expected boundaries between possible and impossible. What I experienced that night has taught me that the mountain has secrets, that some places operate on rules different from the rest of the world, and that some sounds don't travel through space at all. They travel through something else entirely, something that doesn't appear in any textbook about acoustic physics. My name is Stetson, and I'm a 58-year-old retired Forest Service supervisor with over 30 years of experience managing wilderness areas in the North Cascades. I've led hundreds of search and rescue operations. I've trained search teams. I've worked with GPS systems, radios, topographic maps. I know how to navigate. I understand wilderness behavior. I understand disorientation and how search operations function. I have the training and experience to recognize when something violates every principle of wilderness navigation that I've spent my entire career learning and teaching, which is why what happened during one particular search operation continues to haunt me. Even though I've tried for years to find a rational explanation, the search operation began on a cold morning in October. A female hiker named Morgan had gone missing 2 days earlier on a trail in the North Cascades National Park. She was an experienced hiker, properly equipped, had left a detailed itinerary with friends. She should have been easy to track, but she wasn't. The initial search by park rangers had turned up nothing. So the ranger station called me. I had worked in that specific area for decades. I knew the terrain intimately. I was contracted as a search coordinator for complex wilderness operations. I assembled a team of 6 volunteers, all experienced in wilderness navigation. We had GPS units, radios, topographic maps, compasses, search protocols, everything modern rescue operations required. We established a grid search pattern based on standard lost person behavior models. We marked our starting point with orange survey tape. We each carried GPS trackers that would record our movements and location data. We were well-equipped, well-trained, confident that we would eventually locate Morgan. The morning of day 3 of the search, we began our grid pattern in an area where terrain analysis suggested Morgan might have become disoriented. The forest was dense old growth, mixed conifer. Visibility was moderate. The terrain was hilly but navigable. For the first hour of searching, everything was normal. We moved through the forest methodically, maintaining radio contact, checking our GPS positions periodically to ensure we maintained our grid pattern. Then at about 3 hours into the search, the radios began malfunctioning. All 6 team members started receiving the same garbled transmissions simultaneously. All our radios were picking up the same distorted audio, and that audio sounded like our own voices, speaking in reverse, backwards, unintelligible, yet distinctly human. I was hearing my own voice coming through the radio in reverse, distorted, twisted, speaking in a language that was almost English, but not quite. Every team member reported hearing the same phenomenon, their own voices coming back to them in reversed audio. I attempted to retune the radios, to establish contact with the ranger station, to regain normal communication, but the reversed voice, Transmission continued on every frequency I tried. It was like the radios themselves were malfunctioning, or like something was deliberately broadcasting our own voices back to us in distorted form. Then the GPS unit started displaying contradictory information. We were all standing in visual contact with each other, approximately 50 feet from each other in a forest clearing. Yet, our GPS units showed each of us at completely different locations. My unit showed me at one coordinate. One team member's GPS showed them miles away in a different location. Another person's GPS indicated they were somewhere else entirely. We had 6 GPS units all showing 6 different positions for 6 people standing together. The discrepancy made no sense. GPS equipment shouldn't fail like this, especially not all units simultaneously with such extreme variation. I checked everyone's compasses. All 6 team members had compasses, and all 6 compasses were spinning slowly counterclockwise, rotating in a steady, deliberate manner. The compasses weren't responding to the Earth's magnetic field. They were spinning, rotating, behaving as if something was deliberately interfering with their functionality. At that point, my training and experience told me that something fundamentally wrong was happening in this location. Whether it was unusual magnetic anomalies, some kind of geological phenomenon affecting our equipment, or something else, I didn't know, but I knew that continuing our grid pattern was unsafe. I made the decision to consolidate our position and attempt to navigate out of the area. I gathered the team and made a suggestion. I told them that we would walk due north in a straight line until we reached the logging road that should be approximately 45 minutes away. We would move as a group. We would watch for each other. We would maintain physical contact, and we would navigate using only our eyes and terrain features. We would not rely on GPS or compasses. We would simply walk north until we reached the road. We started walking, all 6 of us moving together. I was watching my compass even though it was spinning uselessly, and I was watching the sun position. I was watching terrain features, estimating that we should reach the logging road within 45 minutes at a normal walking pace. But something was wrong. We kept walking, and the terrain began looking familiar. After about an hour of walking, I saw the orange survey tape we had marked at our starting point. We had walked what felt like a straight line for an entire hour, and somehow we had returned to exactly where we started. The team was confused, panicked. I tried to calm everyone. I suggested we must have become disoriented despite walking carefully. I suggested we try again. This time we would walk south, deliberately away from the road, move for an hour, then turn around and walk toward the road. We walked south for approximately 45 minutes. Then we turned around to head north toward the logging road. After another hour of walking what felt like a straight path, we discovered the orange survey tape again. We were back at the starting point, again. This time the panic in the group was more pronounced. The team was frightened. They were questioning what was happening. One team member wanted to call in by satellite communicator for helicopter extraction. I took out my GPS and told everyone I would record a waypoint of our starting location. I recorded it. Then I recorded another waypoint at a second location. Then I displayed the distance between the 2 waypoints. According to the GPS, despite walking what felt like a straight line for nearly 2 hours, the distance was only 0.3 miles. We had barely moved, or the GPS was registering our movement as some kind of circular pattern. I made a final decision. I radioed back to the ranger station. I reported that we were at the starting point, that we were confident we had walked straight in multiple directions, yet we kept returning to the same location. I reported that all our equipment was malfunctioning, GPS, compasses, radios. I requested that they send the helicopter to extract our team, and that they attempt to locate Morgan using aerial search instead of ground operations. The helicopter arrived within the hour, extracted our team, and we were taken back to base camp. I was thoroughly confused, disturbed, frightened by the experience. Later that evening, I downloaded the GPS tracking data from all 6 GPS units. I connected each device to my laptop and examined the movement records. What I found was deeply disturbing. All 6 GPS units had recorded our movements as a mathematically perfect circle. We had walked in a perfect circle with a diameter of 0.83 miles. The circle was so geometrically perfect that it couldn't have been accidental. It was impossible for 6 people to accidentally walk in such a perfect circle without realizing they were circling. But I knew we hadn't been circling. We all felt like we were walking in straight lines. The terrain didn't feel circular. Our intended directions were straight, yet the GPS data was absolutely undeniable. We had walked a perfect circle for 2.5 hours. Morgan was never found. The aerial search didn't turn up any trace of her. She simply vanished from the wilderness. But 3 weeks later, something impossible occurred. Park rangers discovered Morgan's backpack at the exact center of the circle that my team had walked. The center of the mathematically perfect circle that was exactly where our GPS data showed we had been circling. Morgan's backpack was positioned upright, standing on its own, perfectly preserved, completely dry, despite 3 weeks of heavy rain in the area. The backpack had no contents, no food, no gear, just the empty shell of the pack positioned exactly at the center of the circle my team had walked. I began researching the geology and history of that area. I learned about the 1700 Cascadia earthquake, one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded in North America. The earthquake triggered massive landslides and forest destruction throughout the Cascades. In the area where we had searched, I discovered that the forest contained an unusually high concentration of ghost forests, ancient tree stumps preserved in the soil, preserved from the pre-earthquake forest. The modern forest had grown above these remnants, creating a double canopy effect. Living trees above and dead ancient stumps in the soil below. Local legends among indigenous peoples described these ghost forests as places where the forest retained memory of its old configuration, places where spatial navigation became unreliable because the landscape carried imprinted patterns from centuries ago, places where the old forest configuration confused modern navigation, where compasses spun and GPS failed because the Earth itself was caught between 2 different versions of reality. I retired from search and rescue work 2 years after that experience. I couldn't continue operating in a profession where my training, my equipment, my experience, all the tools I had developed over decades could be rendered completely useless by something I don't understand. I couldn't lead teams into the wilderness knowing that something exists in certain locations that violates every principle I had been taught. Morgan was never found. Her backpack remains in park evidence storage, positioned exactly as it was discovered, standing upright at the center of a mathematically perfect circle that 6 people walked without realizing they were circling. I have no explanation for what happened in that location. I only know that some places in the North Cascades don't follow normal rules of navigation. Some places remember what they used to be, and those memories are strong enough to trap people in circles, to confuse their sense of direction, to make experienced navigators walk in perfect mathematical patterns without awareness of their own movement. Thank you for experiencing these 10 disturbing true stories with unspoken fears. These experiences challenge everything we believe about reality and safety. If you've encountered something unexplained in Pacific Northwest forests, please share your story in the comments below. Subscribe to Unspoken Fears for more mysteries that defy explanation. Like this video, turn on notifications, and join our community of believers. The wilderness has secrets, and we're exploring them together.